Hello and welcome to the program. The main event of this month is the EU-Ukraine summit on the 9th of July, and despite the recent law on anti-corruption court, Ukraine still has a long way to go to European standards. What are the main challenges Ukraine still has to overcome to reach them? To talk more about this topic, we're joined in the studio today by Oleksii Makeiev, Political Director at the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of Ukraine. Hello, and thank you for joining us.
Hello.
So first, this summit happens at a point where the EU seems quite divided between the migrant policy, between Poland's controversial laws on justice, between Hungary's open hostile attitude towards Brussels. Is there any room for Ukraine in this context there?
Definitely there is a room, because European Union just recently, 1 week ago, at the Copenhagen Reform Conference clearly stated that Ukraine remains in focus of the European Union. And there is no other country in Europe which is supported by the European Union in reforming, in reaching the standards and changing the country from the post-Soviet mentality and way of living into a truly European country which exists for its citizens.
So Ukraine is facing a challenge between its European path and also having good relations with its neighbor, namely Poland and Hungary, which recently threatened to block NATO's path on Ukraine. How to reconcile the path towards Europe and good relations with its neighbors?
It is very important that we maintain bilateral tracks, both with our Polish partners and Hungarian partners, and we keep on talking to them, although not every capital is willing to maintain the dialogue only in bilateral track. What we do not want is that those institutions and organizations, as NATO and EU, they get into the position of hostages of some capitals wanting to achieve something on bilateral track with the use or misuse of their powers in those organizations. And this is absolutely clear for all other partners in the organizations, that unfortunately Hungarian position is not something which helps those organizations achieving their goals, guaranteeing their security and continuing support in Ukraine. I'm sure we will overcome those challenges, and European Union, both European Union and NATO, will remain our key partners in supporting reforms and countering Russian aggression.
It's actually interesting that you talk about Russian aggression, because recently European MPs Kay Verhofstadt pointed out certain countries in the EU as, quote, with the demeaning term, quote, the fifth column of Russia, namely the far-right now government of Italy, namely also Austria, and also namely Hungary. What does have Europe, what does have NATO to benefit from Ukraine's experience in the matter?
I think our partners now realize that actually the scope of challenges and Russian hybrid instruments which have been used since 2014 against Ukraine, not only aggression, not only disinformation, but also meddling into elections, financing political parties and finding useful idiots, all those instruments are now spread over Europe. And our clear message to our European partners, but also to our American partners, if you want to be ready for elections in 2019, elections to European Parliament, a number of national elections in European countries, and 2020 presidential elections in the US, look at what will be happening in Ukraine next year, because Russia will use all available instruments against Ukraine. And we have a common understanding between our partners that Ukraine needs to be to get assistance, and the lessons learned from countering those Russian hybrid threat would be very useful for every European Union member state and NATO ally and United States in countering further Russian meddling into their democratic processes. So we will be a test case whether we would be able together to get rid of Russian influence and to counter their attacks.
Now you broadened the issue of NATO. NATO, not as Europe, but it's going through a sort of a crisis because Donald Trump, U.S. President Donald Trump, is asking for certain allies to pay their debt in the defense. The G7 and the G20 summit didn't really went that well with U.S. President Donald Trump. How can Ukraine weigh on in the alliance and towards its path to NATO while the alliance seems a bit shaky?
Well, I think we might be the best example for many of the NATO member states because Ukraine spends more than 5% of its GDP for defense. And we know why, because we have to counter Russian aggression, and we are fighting, and our guys are fighting on the front line every day and dying not only for defending sovereignty of Ukraine, but also making lives of Europeans more safe. Yeah, this is why if we would have entered NATO, we wouldn't have any problems in terms of defense spending. But definitely, what our NATO allies also understood, that the Russian meddling and Russian influence is a security threat for NATO. For every single member state, and we have to once again to use Ukrainian experience and to help Ukraine in defending itself and defending Europe.
Now the other big potential event is also the summit, the meeting between U.S. President Donald Trump and Russian President Vladimir Putin, happening soon. How do you foresee the fate of Ukraine after this meeting?
I tell you two things. First, that since 2014, American administration has always been a supporter of Ukraine. And as we see, there is no hint, no chance that such a position would be somehow changed. United States and Washington are our most important international partner in terms of supporting Ukrainian fight against Russian aggression, supporting Ukrainian reforms, providing Ukraine with a defensive weapon, training Ukrainian soldiers. So there is a bipartisan support in the Congress. The administration supports us. This is what we call a strategic ally. And we have a number of countries in the European Union and NATO who belong to this circle of most devoted partners of Ukraine. But we are working with them, and our latest contacts to American administration has given us an opportunity to present our case, to make sure that our partners are aware of the latest developments on the front line, and that ideas how to change this situation and how to urge Russia to get out of Ukraine, of Donbass and Crimea are clearly understood and taken into account by our partners while preparing for negotiations in Helsinki.
Now, one of the topics which might be talked about in the EU summit and also in the summit maybe between Trump and Putin might be the release of Ukrainian prisoner, and notably Oleksii Makeiev. Do you think, do you see a release of Oleksii Makeiev before the end of the World Cup, and how to ensure that it doesn't turn on to a PR stunt for Russia? Just recently, while talking to OEC member states, I pointed at the attempts of Russians
to whitewash their crimes during the World Cup. And everybody today is watching football. Not that many delegations go to Moscow because they took note of our position and follow boycotting the World Cup. But what is most important is that the people all over the world understand that while watching football, the casualties on Ukrainian soil, the casualties of Russian aggression against Ukraine is absolutely unimaginable. And I suggested them to imagine a sector in the football arena, sector K for killed in action, where 10,000 not spectators but covered bodies are there. And these are victims of Russian aggression. Or in the sector W for wounded, there would be more than 25,000 wounded people who are not chanting and cheering their teams, but crying out loud and suffering. Or the sector O for orphan children who would never get their deaths coming home from the front line. These are the consequences of Russian aggression against Ukraine. And everybody who watches football must bear in mind that Kremlin is an aggressor state and is the somebody who provoked a war in the 21st century, a war in Europe.
Well, thank you for reminding those facts, which are always important to remind, and thank you for joining us in the studio today to talk about these topics. That was Oleksii Makeiev, Political Director at the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of Ukraine. Thank you for watching the program. Stay tuned for the rest.